Hi, my name is Garland Favorito. I've got a very special guest here today, and it is John Ainsworth from americasremedy.com. John has done some of the most amazing research that I've ever seen in terms of us figuring out where our government and how it's gotten so far out of control and what we can do about it. So, John, thank you for being here today.
Carl, I want to thank you for having me here, and look forward to this.
Great, thanks, John. So let's start with the question. I think everybody knows that this government in Washington, D.C. has gotten so far out of control. What happened? Even the founding fathers had their principles in place to limit government in the power, but yet it has just expanded rapidly. And how did we get from what the founding fathers envisioned to where we are today?
That's a great question, because we do have people, they're in a state of confusion. They don't understand, like, the government's not operating by the Constitution. And what we've got to do is we've got to revisit the Civil War. And this is a period of time, and we've got to revisit what our founders put into place. Because that's the three key parts: what our founders put into place, what we have today, and then how it changed. And that's why we have to revisit the Civil War.
Okay. So was it in fact a Civil War? I've heard it's more of an uncivil war.
And this is where you get into nuances. Once you understand what that war was about, because everyone's going to have their perspective. Some people say it was a war of northern aggression, war of federal aggression, and what it really was a war of federal aggression. You know, it was the federal government. It wasn't a war between the states. It was a war of the federal government against all the states. And it sounds a little abstract until you do the research and figure out that, because a lot of people say, well, the North won. Well, the northern states lost. If you go what Congress did with the results of the war.
So that's a very interesting thing we want to talk about. But maybe before we get there, let's talk. What about, we've been told and taught, our kids are being taught that this war was about slavery. Was it, in fact, about slavery?
Well, you can't take slavery as being an issue of the times. I mean, it was there. It was an issue of the times. But, if you go to the object of the war and things of this nature, it truly was not, slavery was not the issue of what the war was about. I mean, that's just clearly stated by Lincoln in his inaugural address. It's clearly stated by the object of the war passed by Congress in July of 1861. And it's also addressed by the concept that 30% of the slave states fought for the North. So how would slave states be fighting against slavery? And these are the things that just make it an inconvenient truth.
And in fact, Lincoln himself never said that it was about slavery, did he? Was there ever a quote where he said it was about slavery? What was?
Oh no! In fact, it's quite the opposite. He said if he could free some slaves, and he would do it if it was to preserve the Union. His whole thing was it was preserve the Union.
And now, would the Union have been preserved regardless of action? There, wouldn't we have still had a Union? How many states does it take to make a Union?
Well, the Union would have been preserved. Let's just take a step back real quick here of what we created. What did our founders create? Did they create a federal union or a nation? Because these are terms that we want to try to, in order to go forward, we need people to understand the foundation of what was put into place.
So that's a good question. What is the difference between a federal government and a national government?
And that was the question our founders had. When we were going from the Articles of Confederation, when we were seceding from the Articles of Confederation and going to the Constitution, the big thing was, this is a big change in government. Okay, what is it that we are creating? And so this is what the Federalist Papers were about, of telling the people, because they're going to vote on this, of, do you want to change your form of government? And the term federal and national are interchangeable in American conversation nowadays. But I'm going to go to Federalist 39, written by James Madison. I'm going to make this quote here, read this quote. He said this, each state, in ratifying the Constitution, is considered as a sovereign body, independent of all others, and only to be bound by its own voluntary act. So when they go into this union, they are a sovereign nation. They're an independent country. And they're only bound by what their people say, because all government of right comes from consent of those people, not all people, those people. And he finishes the paragraph by saying, in this relation then, The new Constitution will, if established, be a federal and not a national constitution. Okay, so what's a federal constitution versus a national constitution? The federal constitution is a federation. It's a union of sovereign states, what this is talking about. Each state is a sovereign body. This is why we had the 10th Amendment. These are sovereign bodies. But a national government, excuse me, I've got a little bit hoarse here. And I'm going to read a quote here also from this exact same Federalist paper.
And while you're finding that quote, I think it might be important to mention that James Madison wrote the Federalist Papers, or many of them, in defense of the United States Constitution.
Right. Well, yeah. What the Federalist Papers were actually, they were editorials in the New York newspapers that were published on what is this, and they were kind of going through the clauses and the separation of powers and what it means, and they were doing all that, and they were written by John Jay, who became the first Chief Justice, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. And in Federalist 39, they give us a glimpse of what a national government would look like. They said, if we had a national government, this is what it would look like. And this is what I want to say. This is what the American Civil War was about. This political perspective right here was to nationalize citizenship so that these powers I'm about to talk about would happen. And James Madison in Federalist 39 says this: the idea of a national government involves in it not only an authority over the individual citizens, but an indefinite supremacy over all persons and things, so far as they are objects of lawful government. Among a people consolidated into one nation, this supremacy is completely vested in the national legislature, which would be Congress. In this relation, then, the proposed government cannot be deemed a national one, since its jurisdiction extends to certain enumerated objects only. So we were creating a federal government and not a national government. Now, we were creating a federal government with certain national powers because in the family of nations, we wanted to portray this union as one, but that was in the family of nations. Domestically, we were all sovereign bodies with state rights. We could do whatever we wanted to. And so this is where you go to these certain enumerated powers, national powers granted to Washington, to coin money and do post offices and keep an army and make treaties for us as a body. But domestically, they had no power over us whatsoever. And, so that's the difference between a national and a federal.
So it really was then a war against the states, and rather than between the states, a war by the federal government against the states.
If you go by what Congress promised, they said the war was to preserve the Union with all the dignity, equality, and rights of the several states unimpaired. But if you go to 3 years after the war, they say that it was to get rid of states' rights. Well, which was nationalizing citizenship. And the whole thing is the northern states did not fight to get rid of their own state rights. It was Congress that imposed that at the end of the war, it was about ridding this nation of this pestilent heresy of state rights, as James G. Blaine says.
So that would be leading us into the political overthrow that occurred. But one question before we finish up: did the southern states have the right to secede?
Secession was definitely in our history. Secession really is a formal withdrawal from one political body. The Declaration of Independence was a secession document. It was a formal withdrawal from that political body. If you read it, it says that. And then you've got, when we went from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, that was secession. Because it says once 9 states adopt it through convention, then that new government becomes binding on them. That was a formal withdrawal from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution. So it's part of our history that the right of the people, one of the highest rights of the people, is to alter their form of government and change it and leave one. And that's part of the American foundation, which was this concept of that freedom was put to rest by the American Civil War and Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln waged the war on the principle that all government of right does not come from the people. It comes from the consent of Washington, D.C., the national power.
Which is in direct conflict with our founding principles. So when we come back, I think what we need to do is talk about the Congress. You mentioned, John, that there was not just a military overthrow, but there was a political overthrow. So that, absolutely, I think, is something that many, many people do not know about, and we'll pick that up in the next segment.